Welcome to Teaching Talks. This is a series of discussions with UCI faculty about their classes and their teaching. My name is Andrea Abersold. I'm the Program Director of Faculty Instructional Development here at UCI, and today my guest is Justin Shaffer, Assistant Professor of Teaching Biology, and he's here to talk a little bit more about active learning in his classrooms. So thanks for being here, Justin.
Thanks for having me, Andrea.
So let's start off talking a little bit about what classes you teach and how would you describe your teaching style?
Yeah, so for what I teach here, I'm in the Department of Developmental Cell Biology, and my primary teaching assignments are the large enrollment introductory biology course, BioSci 93. It's about 400 plus students every section in the fall, first quarter freshmen, first year student of college, and it covers things from basic molecules and cells, genetics, a little bit of physiology. And then I also teach the upper division course, Human Anatomy, mostly for majors. We also teach the nursing students there, and that's going to focus on all aspects of the human body, focusing on structure and function. I also teach a couple non-majors classes from time to time. And my teaching style overall, I say, is very active, very student-centered, is what we say in the literature. So we want to make sure that students are at the forefront of what we're doing. We're trying to engage students the best we can using a variety of evidence-based teaching methods and pedagogies. And the goal there is to create an enthusiastic learning environment where students are kind of hooked in a way, engaged in what they're doing, both physically, they're actually doing things in class, right? They're writing, they're drawing, they're talking to each other, but then also mentally they're engaged. They're excited to learn about biology, they're excited to learn about anatomy or other subjects, and this is all based on a lot of literature showing that these are effective ways to teach, and I think it's a lot more fun too, regardless of what the literature would say.
Well, let's talk about some of those strategies to get them engaged, like mentally as well as you said, moving around and doing drawing, things like that. What are one or two of your most favorite strategies to get students engaged?
Yeah, so using different active learning methods, they range from across the spectrum, right? So you can have short little things called 1-minute papers where you just have students take out a piece of paper, write down what was the most challenging thing from class today, or what are they most excited about from class today. Things called think, pair, share, where you have students think about a question first, then they talk to each other, and then they share or report out to the class. Clickers are very common here at Irvine, where you're going to have your remote device. Some people are now using them on your phones and laptops, where you can just click into a multiple choice question or deeper there. And that goes to the other side of the spectrum too, where you have really involved group work, where people are doing these inquiry-based activities, whether they're labs or in lecture, and they're forming groups. They're working for extended periods of time, 15, 20, 30 minutes at a time on a single problem, where the instructor and sometimes learning assistants that we're now using can walk around and help out. I think some of my favorite strategies, though, especially for the larger courses, like Intro Bio with over 400 students, is the peer and structure variant of the clicker question. So for example, that's where you ask a question. Ideally, it's a higher level type Bloom's level question, so application analysis, more than just basic facts and memorization. And we're going to ask them to do it on their own. So they look at some data maybe and answer it on their own. And then they will click in and tell me the answer. And then I'll say, okay, now go ahead and talk to each other about it. See if you can convince your neighbor of what you think the answer is. Maybe they'll convince you, argue about it. And then after about a minute or so, we'll have you click in again. And then they'll click in again, and then I will show them the results. And they'll say, most of the time, they move in the right direction. So you can say, hey, look, you don't need me. You're doing this all on your own, because that is a very powerful way of learning, that peer instruction, peer variant. That was a literature and that published in Science, and that was actually showing this strong result that students are benefiting from this type of peer instruction using that clicker. So I think it's a really fun way too to show that they're empowered in a way, they can do it, they help each other out. Makes it a great learning environment. And then me too shows that they are able to do it, just they need a little bit of time to do that together. So I think that's one of the best things to do in the larger classes, is just get them active, but in these short bursts of time. You don't need to focus on, in my opinion, at least in my style, long 10, 15-minute worksheets, but just minute or 30 seconds, minute at a time, little things, just repeatedly engaging. It can be really powerful.
Great. And how do students respond? What have they had to say about your strategy?
Yeah, so this is funny. I like, on the first day of class, I show students sample student evaluations from past classes, because I tell them how great this is why we do active learning, this is why we have pre-class assignments and weekly quizzes, and here's what the literature says, here's what I say, but then I said, well, what do the past students have to say? And I highlight some positive quotes, things like, his teaching style is engaging, it keeps me involved with the material, it's hard to fall asleep, things like that. And then I also show them the negatives, and they're saying it's distracting sometimes, and I like closing with one that says, he should just lecture. This is not working for me at all. And I say, okay, I failed there for that person, obviously, But they generally overwhelmingly positive type of responses. They tend to enjoy that interactive. If you look at evaluations there, you can see it and feel it in the classroom too. There are certain days where I tend to talk more and longer periods of time on necessity, and just the atmosphere is a little more, reserved, and I don't see as much, maybe something's going on. I'm sure they are working on the material and thinking about it, but it just isn't as apparent that they're excited about it or wanting to do the work or wanting to learn about that aspect of biology. So again, it's just that immediate feedback you get from the change in the mood, change in the atmosphere from doing active learning, but then also the deeper things you can get from measuring the positive effects of active learning through performance, through attitudes, through evaluations, things like that. Tend to show positive signs.
Great. I'm sure it probably helps too in those large classes with students who feel like they're this faceless number, that it's too large for a professor to know them. At least with them engaging with the students around them as well as you, it might help a really large class feel smaller, even though it's quite big.
It's huge, and I think that you hit on that issue of that community in a large lecture hall, is that you want to make it feel as small as possible, and one of the best ways to do that is to get them to know each other in these small groups, but also for me. So one thing I do to help with that too is just use their names. And I get comments saying, I can't believe he knows our names, and I don't know everyone's name, obviously 400, but I know enough, and I just ask them. So every time I ask a question, if someone raises their hand, I'll say, okay, what's your name? They want to answer a question or ask, what's your name, and I'll repeat it back to everyone else. So it just helps me learn them, but it also helps, again, kind of make it feel a little smaller, where that students are getting to know each other, I'm getting to know them, and again, try to make that community feel a little more strong that you sometimes lack, like you said, with the faceless number type thing.
So when you sit down to design one of these engaged, active classes, where do you start? What are your priorities in designing a class?
Yeah, so whether it's the whole course or a single day class, a lot of what I do has the roots in what's called backward design. So this is the idea that you start with what do you want students to be able to do, rather than with the content. So oftentimes, and this is how I was when I first started, and teaching, even when I was a student, you start with, well, what's in this chapter? What's in the book? What do I need to cover? Not necessarily what do you want students to be able to do. So in almost every case, the book is too much. There's too much stuff for the time we have, especially in the quarter system. So you should focus on what you want students to be able to do. And you write these learning objectives or learning outcomes. You might have big goals for the course and then objectives for each day of class, maybe 3 or 4 a day. And these are things that students can actually do. So, you want them to be able to compare and contrast the properties of proteins and carbohydrates. You want them to be able to predict how a molecule will cross the cell membrane. So these things they can do. And then once you know what students should be able to do, you can easily design the curriculum around it. So you can design pre-class work. So do you want students to be able to read the book before class, or maybe watch a video to acquire some content? Do you want to test them before class to make sure they have the basics? In class, you can design activities and questions that get at these objectives. So if you wanted students to be able to compare and contrast proteins and carbohydrates, maybe you have an activity where you show them a bunch of different structures and you say, okay, which ones are proteins, which are carbohydrates, sort them into the right bins, talk to your neighbors, figure that out. If you want them to predict how a molecule crosses a membrane, give them some data and interpret it. Is this molecule crossing? Is it not? Why or why not? So it's that the goals, the objectives really drive the instruction there. If you just started with the book and kind of marched through it, you might be doing too much, and you also might not be sure of what's important. And having these goals or objectives helps me as an instructor to kind of narrow down what I want to do, helps me design what I think are effective activities and curricular design choices, but it also tells the students what they need to be able to do, so it's very transparent. I like to tell students, I want to assess what you know, not what you think I want you to know. right? So this helps them say, if you can do these things, you're doing well, you're on the right track. So it hits a kind of two big areas by doing that.
Yeah, and I think the focus, like you said, on goals and outcomes for yourself also maybe keeps you from falling into that trap of content-driven teaching. I know so many professors feel pressure, like I've got to cover so much content, and then you forget about the skills that students should also be learning.
Yeah, and that's tremendously important. You think about it, you have the content in your pocket at any second nowadays. So I feel like, especially in an introductory biology course where you're trying to lay foundational skills and development of critical thinking for going through with their major and then their career, learning how to access the information, how to evaluate it, how to use the knowledge, how to read the book properly, how to do X, Y, and Z is much more important than just the basic. I mean, the facts are important, sure. You need to know that to understand how a cell works, but being able to use that information in new settings, that's going to be the hallmark of what you do as a scientist, as a clinician, as a researcher, as an engineer, whatever. So you have to learn how to use it too.
So besides size, what are some challenges in using active learning strategies, and how have you dealt with those challenges?
So I think one of the major things, there's two major ones I'll talk about. One is kind of student pushback, and the other one is time. So I'll start with the student pushback. So sometimes when you try these things, you might feel they don't work, right? And this could be a variety of reasons. One is the activity just was poorly planned, or the first time you're doing it, it's not going to work. Second is the students are resistant to it. You might find this more in upper division courses or places where students are used to a particular style of teaching. And then you come along and you want them to do, jump up and down and draw circles and do all this stuff. You're like, no, I don't want to do this. I've been used to just taking notes and I'm fine. So you have to sell it. Selling it's really important, and that's what I do starting the first day of class by showing data from the literature. Here's why pre-class assignments are effective. Here's what the literature shows. Here's why, or here's what active learning can do to improve performance and learning and retention. And I just hit on that all the time, saying, I'm not doing this just for busy work. I'm not doing this for something to do. There are pedagogical goals and then evidence-based reasons for teaching this way. And so by doing that, I think helps reduce that kind of pushback barrier. And then also, like I mentioned earlier, I think it is a lot more fun. The class does tend to fly by in a way, at least in my mind. And so that way you're just engaged, you're working, you're doing things, you're always, and you know how people's attention spans, and mine own included, can just decay really quickly, if you're jolted to do something different. So by doing something different every couple minutes, ask a question, show a video, do a drawing, talk to each other, your clicker question, you're just keeping that going, and you're going to hopefully engage them a little bit more in that, and they'll realize, hey, this is a lot more fun, and this is more engaging. And then the other issue is time. So time is a big one at many levels. So time to create the activities, time to test them out maybe beforehand if you're interested, time to implement them in class. Because I can talk through a slide showing a piece of data or a biological mechanism a lot faster than having them first think about it on their own, then click in about it, then talk to their neighbor to discuss it, then click in again, then ask for a couple explanations why, then I finally get to the take home. But what happened in that time period is very different, and thus the benefits of active learning, I think, very much outweigh the time. But again, if you implement these things, you're going to have to take things out. Most likely. So that's where a bigger idea of what's called high structure course design comes into play. So that's the idea, or the flipped classroom, some people call it. So let's move some stuff before class, hold students accountable for it, so then when you get to class, I like to say you can hit the ground running. You don't necessarily have to lecture over the basic stuff if you're confident that students are preparing ahead of time. And they will prepare ahead of time if you, one, hold them accountable, so some type of pre-class quiz, pre-class assignment worth credit, and then two, they see that in order to succeed in lecture, they actually have had to do the prep. So some of my students have told me anecdotally and in evaluations that if they don't prepare for a day of class and they come to class, they feel really lost, and that's really discouraging. And I sympathize with that, especially if they have a lot going on, family, work, whatever. But in order to stay on top of things, in order to succeed, to be able to apply, analyze higher types of thinking, you have to prepare. So if you're confident that you're able to move content ahead of class via pre-class reading, videos, whatever, and hold them accountable, and then you build off that in class. You don't just repeat what you read about, you actually do different stuff that holds them accountable for what they did before class. You're able to do a lot of these activities, you're able to implement a lot of these things that they're gonna, again, take more time, but they're deeper. Students are working, they're learning, they're thinking, they're actively engaged versus a more traditional type of lecture setting.
Yeah, I hear from a lot of professors about those challenges that you just brought up in terms of time or student resistance. They just want to come to a lecture and listen and leave. One of the biggest ones I hear is about size. There's too many students to do things, along with the way the room is for these large lectures. So tables don't move, chairs don't move. If you want students to get up and do something, there's just not an easy way to make that happen. So as someone who teaches these large classes, what advice would you give to someone who feels like active learning just may not work in their large class?
Yeah, that is a concern because these tiered lecture halls, they weren't designed for this type of stuff. They were designed for receiving information, listening to a lecture, and so they're good for that. But within a given row, you have immediately two people next to you, one on each side. If you want to just do that real quick, you have someone behind you, someone in front of you, and it's easy to quickly check in with at least 4 or 5 people right then and there. So yeah, you're not going to be maybe forming concrete groups and having them rotate through groups or mixing up during a lesson period, because I think that would be pretty difficult to manage. I'm sure some people do it well. I haven't figured out a way to do that one, but just starting small, I guess, is the idea that to do active learning, one, you can do active learning individually, right? You don't even have to have groups for that, right? You can just have a student do something on their own. So you don't really need the peers. But there is literature showing that the peer form of active learning does help address higher level Bloom's activities, again, things like applying, analyzing, evaluating information and data. So the group work is really important for that. But again, in that lecture hall, you're going to have at least, if you're even not turning behind you or in front of you, you have 2 people, one on each side. So you can have a group of 3 immediately. To do this. So you don't necessarily need a formal table or a rotating chairs or anything like that. You can get by. You don't necessarily need lots of screens and different audio equipment. So you can make it work with what you have, I think, as long as you're confident in it and being willing to try new things out. But again, starting small is easy. Just instead of asking a question to the whole class and waiting for a student or 2 to raise their hand, say, okay, first talk to each other about it. Just turn to who's sitting next to you, give them 20 seconds, talk about it, and then ask for the question, someone from the class to raise their hand. It can really change the mood dramatically. But again, showing confidence is important. I think if you're up there and as an instructor and saying, I'm not sure if this is going to work, I'm not really into this, but we're going to try it anyway, things like that. These cues might lead to some failure. But again, just displaying confidence too, and then also being willing to try it again in these large, or any setting, but especially these large lecture halls. If it doesn't work the first time, it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It could have been some issue with implementation. Scott Freeman is a famous biology education researcher, biology textbook author, and instructor at University of Washington, and he likes to say to that question that, I tried active learning but it doesn't work. And he likes to say, and this is a biology term, but he said, well, the first time I tried PCR, it didn't work either. But PCR is a tried and true piece of experimental method for 30 plus years that works. Just because you didn't do it right doesn't mean the technique doesn't work, right? So you've got to be willing to try again and again. And again, it takes time, it takes confidence, but you get there. So just start small. Even in the big rooms, you can do it, but you just got to be willing to really work with it.
So what influenced you to teach this way? You're very familiar with the literature. Was it reading about things? Did you have professors that taught this way when you were in school?
So I don't remember many instances of this type of teaching when I was a student. I went to Penn State, chemical engineering major many years ago now, and it was primarily didactic based. The one thing from that though that sticks out to me is a professor that it was a very smaller class, 10, 12 students, and he asked for an explanation, and I gave mine, and it went on like 30 seconds, and he's like, okay, well, that's not right. And I was like crushed, oh crap, you know. But he's like, well, tell me why you thought that. And I'm like, what? And he said, no, it was, tell me, walk me through your thought process. So I went another 30 seconds or so, and he was says, and I went back, keep going. So it was just really amazing, that back and forth, and it really stuck with me, that one specific memory from Dr. Boran from Penn State many, many years ago. But that way that you just engage with the instructor and that thinking through things rather than just listening the whole time and working that. So that had a profound effect on me. But then the real way that I started teaching this way was through my postdoctoral training. So I went through a training program at North Carolina at Chapel Hill called SPIRE, where you got training in research but also in teaching. So, and it was evidence-based teaching methodology. So I was exposed to active learning formally. I was trained how to teach this way and given opportunities to do that as well through institutions in North Carolina. So I had a couple cracks at kind of trying new things, refining, having really great mentors there at Carolina to help me out. And then coming here, you know, that's what I was going to do from day one. You know, this is how I was trained to do. This is what the evidence, what the literature shows. And then I kind of find my way, find my niche. But I don't do everything that the literature shows is effective, right? Because it doesn't fit me. And that's an important thing too to consider with the teaching, any type of teaching style, especially active learning, though, is finding your niche. So this is what I encourage my teaching assistants to do. We have many teaching assistants in intro bio, and when they do their smaller discussion sections, I tell them to try things out, and they come to lecture and they see how I teach, and I say, you don't have to do what I do because it might not feel comfortable, right? I want you to try what works for you. And maybe you'll like doing the think, pair, share type activities. Maybe you'll like doing drawings. Maybe you like them coming to the board, but maybe you like these things instead. So it's just going to find your style. Like in my classes, I like to walk around a lot, but I don't really, you know, lean in and say, what do you think while they're talking? You know, I just kind of walk around and listen and see what's going on. But other instructors really like to sit down the stairs and have a conversation back and forth, you know. So it's just not my style. So that's going to take time too to develop when you're trying these activities, is to figure out, you know, what works for me. Yeah, there's this great paper that says this is effective, but if it doesn't feel right, you know. And the same thing too with the piece of technology. We have so much technology used in the classroom now, whether it's just, you know, it's traditional eye clickers or more or web-based systems now, or you know, even these new microphones and things. Just because the technology exists doesn't mean you have to use it. It has to feel right. You know, you have to incorporate it organically. If you're trying to shoehorn, whether it's an active learning method or technology or anything else that doesn't fit your style, it's going to be difficult, I think, to make it work for you.
That's really good advice about making it feel comfortable for you, because I think if you're teaching with a strategy that feels awkward or not something you're interested in, students will probably pick up on that too, and that might influence their resistance to what you're doing. So the last question I have for you is, how do you know you're succeeding as a teacher? How do you know these strategies are working?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's what we, as instructors, we want to be able to show. You know, we want to be able to demonstrate that we're succeeding, and you can measure that a variety of ways, whether it's you know, students' performance on exams, whether it's positive evaluations, whether it's students that many years from now write you back and say, oh, I still remember this class, and I have my book, and it helped me so much in medical school. You know, there's lots of ways to vary it. But I think for me, you can measure it, you know, kind of in the moment and then the larger picture. So by seeing, especially to these variants of peer instruction, like I mentioned, you know, do the clicker question first, then talk about it, then click in again, and usually see it go up. So I mean, you get this automatic check with the clickers right away that, okay, they're getting it, they're learning, they're able to answer, or they're not, you know. And that helps the students realize that, okay, I understand this material or I don't. And that's half their battle, I feel like, as a learner, is figuring out what do you understand, what do you not understand, and then you can address that. And then it helps me identify right away, are the things I'm doing effective? And I'm able to use that data to modify my instruction. So I have this example in the intro bio course that talks about osmosis, or how water moves between different states across the membrane. And I use gummy bears as this example. And I used to do this one activity with the gummy bears that just caused a mass amount of confusion. And no matter what I tried, it wouldn't work. And I said, okay, I need to change this. Like, changed it last year, and like, oh, magically better, you know? So you know, because of that clicker data. So you're able to use the clicker data in the moment to see how students are learning, you know? And then you can use that as well, maybe not for an advanced activity, but just for their pre-class work. You know, you come in, do you know what this molecule is? Simple multiple choice question. You see 90% correct. Okay, good, it's working. The pre-class assignments are working, right? So they're learning, they're able to answer this question. So you can use that to build along the way. And then ideally you have your exams to see how things are doing, you know. So are students performing at different levels on your exams? So what I like to do is for each of my exam questions, I bloom them. So that's assigning the Bloom's level. So is it memorization, understanding, application, analysis, etc. And I really like to promote, again, critical thinking skill development in my courses. So if I see students doing well on the application analysis type questions, that's great. That's giving me a lot of feedback that they're able to apply their knowledge. They're able to analyze new information, and those are my major goals for the course. So that's really useful. And then just as succeeding in terms of you know, a positive classroom environment, and students feel that they're learning and that they're supported and they're able to continue on and be excited about the biology major and thing. I mean, you can feel that in a way from just the atmosphere of the classroom, but then also the evaluations, whether it's midterm evaluations, whether it's end of course evaluations, whether it's surveys that we do. Probably do too many surveys in my course now, but just finding out what students are thinking, you know, why they think this way, and you know, seeing, are they excited about it? Are they responding to this type of feedback? And then I do like hearing too, it's always comforting to get that email back a couple years later, or hearing from another professor like, hey, they said about you that they, you know, I'm like, oh, that's really nice, you know. So you hear anecdotally, you have hard data that can show it too. And we're trying to, I guess, all that together can help you say, okay, you did a good job. And that's ultimately what we want to do, right? We want to give them the best course experience we can.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks so much for joining me today, Justin, and sharing your thoughts about your teaching and your active learning strategies. It's really interesting.
Thanks, Andrea. It was fun.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us for Teaching Talks, and I hope you'll join us for our next discussion.